Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk about Czech politics, which I've had a quite special interest in for about, I guess, 25 years. I'm Sean Hanley. I'm lecturer in comparative Central and East European politics. And I'm going to talk through this weekend's elections, which, as the title slide suggests, it's really the end of the world as we know it for conventional Czech politics as it's developed since the mid-90s. And it is a watershed election. We don't really know what direction the country is going in, but we know that we're in uncharted waters. So let's just start off with the results. Now you'll see here that there are no fewer than 9 parties represented now in the 200-member lower house of the Czech Parliament, resulting from the elections held on last Friday and Saturday. Czech Republic has a proportional system based on party lists in 14 unevenly sized regional constituencies, and as in much of Central and Eastern Europe and indeed Western Europe, there's a 5% threshold. So the clear winner is the ANO movement. ANO means yes in Czech, led by the Slovak-born billionaire Andrej Babiš. Babiš entered politics only 4 years ago, in 2013, with his party, which broke into parliament and has been part of a rather acrimonious coalition with the Social Democrats and the smaller Christian Democratic Party. He was finance minister until he was forced out over corruption, more than allegations, they're now charges, in May, which is to say he denies everything. More about that later. The party came in 30%, and it's by far the largest party now in a very fragmented parliament, with 78 seats out of 200, so somewhat short of the majority. In second place comes a party I know very well, the ODS, the Civic Democratic Party, which is a party which once dominated Czech politics in the 1990s, which has modelled itself on the British Conservative Party. It's a free market, centre-right, Eurosceptic, mildly socially conservative party, which collapsed in 2013 in a corruption scandal when it was part of a governing centre-right coalition, and has clawed its way back somewhat from 7% to 11%, which is pretty good going by the standards of conventional parties. Then we move on to an unconventional party and a new party, the Czech Pirate Party. Like other pirate parties in Europe, which have emerged in Sweden, in Iceland, in Germany, its origins are in the kind of online world of campaigning for transparency, of a looser kind of copyright, and it's a kind of alternative, rather hippie-ish party whose leader, kind of Ivan Bartosz, kind of sports dreadlocks and plays the accordion and has a doctorate in computer science. In this election, though, it didn't campaign so much on the kind of core pirate issues to do with the internet and internet freedom as on anti-corruption. Its slogan was just let us at them, and them being the old established parties, and we'll deal with things. It's a very familiar kind of theme in Czech politics, which is, as I'll explain, has had a series of good government anti-corruption parties, some of which have turned out to be anything but. Then we have the SPD. The SPD is the Freedom and Direct Democracy grouping led by the Japanese Czech businessman Tomio Okamura. Japanese name, but someone who is in fact more Czech than Japanese. He's not a new face in Czech politics. He was in Parliament before with a different grouping, and we can fairly say he's a right-wing populist, anti-Islam, warning about the dangers of uncontrolled immigration, the Czech Republic, of which there is basically none. In the past, anti-Roma, a showman, someone given to outrageous statements, who's known to the Czech public previously as one of the judges on the Czech versions of Dragon's Den. He claims to be a kind of successful travel and lifestyle entrepreneur. He's not really as rich as he says he is, but he's certainly an able populist politician. And his party has come in with just under 11% of the vote, which is the highest for any kind of radical right movement in the Czech Republic, I think, ever. Then we have another radical party, the KSČM, the KSČM, the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia. They've been around a long time. They're the successor of the former Czech half of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. They're hardline, orthodox communists, a very loyal, stable voter base, predominantly elderly, never really had much reach beyond that kind of subculture. Here they come in with a very, for them, low 8% and suffer significant losses. Polls had them about 12, 13%. They polled anything between 10 and 15% in most elections. That's surprising. And now here's the biggest casualty of the night, the Social Democrats. They were the senior governing party, the outgoing senior partner in the coalition. The Prime Minister, Bohuslav Sobotka, was a Social Democrat in the same government where Babiš was finance minister. They got 20% in the last election, which was a historic low for them. They've really sunk and plumbed the depths here. They've lost 35 mandates, 35 deputies, and they're right down below 10% in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th place. So they really have suffered a meltdown. Then we have the small Christian Democratic Party. It's moderate, Christian Democratic, as the name suggests, but it's always been something of a niche party, and it tends to just creep above the 5% barrier, and it has done so again, slightly losing support. Then we have a party called Topo 9, which is a centre-right pro-EU party. Originally came on the scene in 2010 as a more kind of pro-European liberal rival to the Civic Democrats. Gradually been losing support and goes down from 26 to 7 deputies. Just crept in. Everyone thought, watching the Czech TV news coverage of the election on Saturday afternoon, that it wasn't going to make it, and it made it thanks to votes in Prague. It's a very heavily supported party in Prague, but as we'll see, it has problems. And finally, we have a party called STAN, which is the Mayors and Independents Party. They're a kind of a new party. They're a kind of grassroots local movement of mayors leaning towards the centre-right. They were previously in an alliance with TOP. Then they formed an alliance with the Christian Democrats. Then in July they fell out because they realised they would struggle to meet the 10% threshold for coalitions. And surprisingly, the Mayors and Independents have just crept into Parliament, making them the 9th party. Okay, so that's what we see. So what's surprising? What's not surprising in Czech politics? Okay, well, what we expected. Andrej Babiš, who's seen here embracing and about to kiss his social media guru, won with 30% and was ahead of all other parties. That's very much in line with opinion polls. Some people thought he might go a bit higher. There was some talk that maybe he could just push it and get an absolute majority. It has happened with PR systems in Slovakia and Poland, but he didn't. But he won by a large margin. He's a controversial politician because he's a businessman. He owns important chunks of the media, 2 national dailies, radio station, websites associated with the national dailies, and the Agrofert conglomerate, which basically occupies most of the Czech agricultural, food and forestry sector. So if you buy a roll in the Czech Republic, it will have been through one of Andrej Babiš, or sausage for that matter, or indeed a donut. The party's signature freebie to voters is to give away donuts, sometimes by Babiš personally. He controls a significant part of the Czech agricultural and food sector, worth 5 billion. He's controversial because of his ownership of the media. He said, no, I won't interfere in the political coverage of my newspapers. We now know that he does, and he uses them really to target political opponents, kind of subverting the tradition of investigative journalism. His papers aren't outrageously biased, but they present his views and report on scandals concerning his political opponents. Plenty of scandals concerning him, and he's currently facing charges. He looks like he's been nominated by the President Miloš Zeman as Prime Minister designate. He hasn't formed a coalition yet, but he's designated to form one. And he's the only, I think, European Prime Minister facing criminal charges to be in this position. They concern this place, the Stork's Nest, a high-end resort near Prague. It looks lovely. It's got a hotel, stables, restaurant. I mean, I wonder if I can afford to go there on holiday. It's a flagship project for Babiš, and in 2008 he claimed 2 million euros of EU subsidies for it, claiming that he was a small enterprise. The ownership of the Stork's Nest was obscured through the use of anonymous shares, now illegal but once common in Czech business, and on that basis he claimed EU subsidies. In fact, it belonged to him all along, and the police are pressing charges. It's very, very small given his kind of assets, but opponents really have been looking out to try and catch him and trip him up, and being a billionaire and Czech business being what it is, there was bound to be something. There are probably lots of Stork's Nest scandals across the Czech Republic, but he being Minister of Finance. The result wasn't a surprise. If we look at the opinion polls, ANO is the ANO is the blue party, which is always in the lead. The Social Democrats are the orange party, and we can see the Social Democrats gradually declining throughout the year, falling off here disastrously when the successful attempt to push Babiš out of the cabinet didn't succeed with them politically. The Stork's Nest scandal hasn't impacted Babiš's support. Opinion polling suggests that he's a kind of Marmite politician. About half of Czechs think he's totally unsuitable to be Prime Minister. About half of Czechs think he's absolutely fine and aren't bothered by the fact that the Stork's Nest scandal and the other issues. So, first, unsurprising surprise, Babiš wins. Second unsurprising surprise, Tomio Okamura, the far-right populist leader, does well. Opinion polls have been suggesting that he would do well for several weeks, a couple of months. Here's the man himself, and here's his politics. We still have influence in the European Union in this country, at least on the far right. This says, let's leave the EU English style. He wants a referendum, he wants Czechsit. He's the only party in Parliament that does want this. He wants to ban mosques, ban Sharia law, give people who bring up their children properly, and that's code for people who aren't Roma, social security benefits, and generally lots of populist stuff. It's a familiar tune. He's a kind of ebullient, motor-mouthed politician, and very personally popular, surprisingly. He's the second most trusted Czech. So he's back, and he's more popular than ever. Okay, his last party fell apart. It only had about 9 members, but it still fell apart. So he's back with the SPD. That wasn't surprising. So, and if we look at where his votes are, we can see, in fact, that this is a pattern we've seen before with the previous radical right party represented in the Czech Parliament, which is the Republicans. And we can see here in kind of northwest Bohemia, which is a region with multiple social problems, this is where they pick up support. And also in the eastern kind of part of the Czech Republic, in Moravia, which is where Okamura comes from, and which is generally a bit more rural, a bit less prosperous. Interestingly, the same pattern with ANO votes, okay, which is interesting. And the story is with Babiš, who presents himself as a centrist politician appealing to everyone, and did appeal to a very wide swathe of voters of all classes and all occupational groups and all regions in 2013. He started to pick up electors on the left, mainly people who used to vote Social Democrat, in these kind of poorer regions, which Tomio Okamura also benefited from, although Okamura appeared to have been drawing support from people who had previously voted for the Communist Party, especially unemployed people. So the story of the communist decline is Okamura. The story of ANO's success is taking votes off the Social Democrats. So we have a billionaire who leads his own movement, who's starting to draw votes from the left. I'll talk a bit later about if he's a Czech Trump or not. Again, an unexpected surprise. Here are the Pirates. They have the best campaign song out. There's Ivan Bartoš with his dreadlocks, with his accordion. He really can play it. With his battle bus, with his supporters, and polls predicted that they would get in, and they did. And their support is, so they get in with 22 deputies, and their support, we can see here, is heavily concentrated in Prague and the Prague region. Did very well in Prague, and as we'll see, they're a young person's party, did well with younger voters and more metropolitan voters. So here is České Budějovice, and here is Brno, the main kind of city in Moravia. And so the Pirates are really a party of the young, oh dear, what have I done now? Of the educated and of a few bigger cities. They seem to have taken votes from the Top 09, which has a very similar profile, but many less votes. And we can see here that Top 09 really is a party which only has strong support in Prague, in Brno, and in České Budějovice, and those Prague voters push the party narrowly over the 5%. So Top 09, pro-European, socially liberal, pro-market, they've been kind of eclipsed by the Pirates. Okay. Right, what we didn't expect. We knew the Social Democrats were going to lose votes, but we never imagined they would lose this many votes. The outlying polls had them on 10%, and they went right down to close to 7%. It's a disaster for them. It's questionable, how easily they can come back. They're not completely down, but they have a lot of rebuilding to do. Even the Civic Democrats, who did a lot of consolidation, a lot of cleaning out, a lot of corrupt associations, a lot of discredited figures pushed out, and they only got 11%. And the communists, who would have thought it? I wouldn't have thought it. Famous for the stability of their vote, and yet they're losing votes to Okamura, and they're losing to some extent votes to Andrej Babiš. So nobody saw the extent to which the left-wing vote would go down. It's only about 15% these parties have between them. It fits into a pattern of social democratic parties doing badly just about everywhere. So there will be splits and discussions in these parties, and the Social Democrats are the ones to watch because they've got the biggest potential appeal. There are a lot of voters in the Czech Republic who want a kind of centre-left social market, and the Social Democrats really need to do a lot of thinking. In particular, they need to think about where they position themselves on the imaginary refugee question. Czech parties, President Zeman, Okamura outrageously, but really all parties and Czech public opinion, which is really driving this, are deeply concerned about the prospect of mass immigration into the Czech Republic, which doesn't actually exist. Very few refugees and asylum seekers, even at the height of the crisis, entered the Czech Republic. Most who did so wanted to transit the country, and as people have pointed out, there are fewer people who've been granted asylum in the Czech Republic than there are members of parliament in Okamura's party, 12 versus 22. And as I'm very fond of saying, the census shows that there are more Jedi Knights than there are Muslims in the Czech Republic by a considerable measure. But really this issue is a kind of symbolic one which expresses the fears of a relatively small country faced with kind of global and European forces it can't really control. So it's a kind of standing issue for a lot of kind of social uncertainties. It seems kind of comic and ridiculous, but there's something deeper underlying it. And the deeper thing underlying it is that the West is no longer a model. So politicians are looking over at Germany and this country and not saying this is a successful model we have to copy, but this is a multicultural failure which we must avoid. Okay, and Czech public opinion is very, very kind of, very, very concerned about this, and no parties can really afford to be on the wrong side of the issue. Even the libertarian pirates emphasise that they did not support the EU's policy of compulsorily allocating quotas of refugees or asylum seekers to EU member countries. The Czech Republic was to have about 1,000. So the left, huge defeat. 42% of voters made their mind up at the very last minute. We know that Central European electorates are volatile. We know that we don't have the kind of party loyalties, the party traditions, the party memberships we have in Western Europe. But 42% in the last week is extraordinary even by Czech standards. The electorate is very, very, very volatile. We didn't expect that. Okay, Andrej Babiš. ANO is the pensioner's choice. This is a breakdown of voting by age group. It's not an exit poll, but it's a poll done before the election for Czech television by Median. And this says vote by age. And what we see is that the communists, unsurprisingly, older people vote for them heavily, so 13% of older people voted for them, double their general vote. Social Democrats have a similar profile, they appeal much more to older voters. The Pirates appeal to younger voters, no surprises there. The Civic Democrats also did well with younger voters, that's good news for them. And Tomio Okamura, who was supposed to be a favourite with young people, actually does better with middle-aged people, interestingly. But look at ANO. ANO appeals to, has the profile of a left-wing party now. It used to have a much more kind of catch-all electorate with support evenly balanced in 2013, but Babiš's movement is much more popular on the middle-aged and the old and did badly among young people, which is interesting about its possible future direction. People always say, is it left or right? I say, I don't know. I thought it would go right and fill in the kind of vacuum left by the collapse of the Civic Democrats. Now, who knows where it will go, but there's been shifts in its electorate in a very interesting way. Next surprise, 9 parties in Parliament. What is going on? Even for a PR system, that seems a bit much. It's the largest number since 1989. Now, the reason for this is that new parties have been making headway, the Pirates, Okamura, ANO, and old parties have been losing, but they haven't been losing to the extent that they're out of Parliament, which is interesting. These older parties, so the Social Democrats, the Communists, Topo 9, even Stan, they clearly have enough support and enough of a base and enough organisation to hang on. And although they can't form a coalition together, they haven't got the votes and they don't agree politically, they may be able to bite back. They certainly teamed up in the last Parliament to pass the Lex Babiš, the Babiš law, which was designed to ban ministers from holding large stakes in companies, i.e. Andrej Babiš, because he's the only one that did. He's sidestepped it by putting his property into a trust. But story here is that the old parties are down but not completely out, and that's what's produced this extraordinary fragmentation. Last surprise is Stan, that's the mayors and independents, that they made it into Parliament at all. And that tells us something. If we look at its support, there's the support for the mayors and independents. It's incredibly localised. Christian Democrats always get this kind of vote. They are very strong in Moravia and in traditionally Catholic regions. If you'd looked at their predecessor 120 years ago, you'd have seen exactly the same pattern. Very, very, very stable. So, what's happening now and what's happening next? It's impossible for there to be any government which doesn't feature ANO, and the President has nominated Andrej Babiš as a Prime Minister designate. Andrej Babiš doesn't think it's a problem that he's facing criminal charges. He says he's innocent. Look at Berlusconi, look at Chirac in France, and Miloš Zeman, who is a former Social Democrat, sort of turned nationalist populist, is an ally of Babiš, and also doesn't think it's a problem. All the other parties, however, do think it's a problem, and have refused so far to work with Babiš either at all, so that's the Civic Democrats and the Pirates, or if Babiš is in the government. Okay. So that leaves us with a problem. There are negotiations going on at the moment, so Babiš says, I want to talk to all parties about the general situation, and they've been beating a path to his door and generally telling him that they don't want anything to do with him. There's going to be difficulties in forming a government, because we can't have one with Babiš and we can't have one without Babiš. There's the only kind of two-party coalition would be Andrej Babiš with the Eurosceptic Conservatives of the Civic Democratic Party. They've said no way, at least they've said no way so far. A range of kind of three-party coalitions are possible. The outgoing coalition of Social Democrats and Christian Democrats would have a majority, but so far the Social Democrats and Christian Democrats don't want to be in the same government as Babiš. Indeed, it would be the kiss of death pretty much for any party to be in with Babiš, because he would dominate the government. He would have a huge majority of ministries and would be very powerful, and the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats have suffered from being in government, remarkably given how well the Czech economy is performing. Lowest unemployment in the EU, economic growth, labour shortage, but all the credit seems to have gone to the Finance Minister Andrej Babiš. So there are going to be difficulties forming a government. It's possible there could be a minority government, and so it's a matter of just watch this space if you're interested in Czech politics. Be prepared for some very long, drawn-out negotiations. The only thing we know is that Babiš and his party are and are going to remain in the driving seat. Okay, so what happens next in the wider sense? Now, if you've read the press coverage, Babiš is depicted as a Czech Trump. He's supposed to be a populist, he's supposed to be a right-winger, and there's some truth in the comparison. Obviously, he's a rich man, a billionaire who's gone into politics. Obviously, like Silvio Berlusconi, he owns a lot of media. He's a person who likes power and is good at accumulating it. He built up his business empire very ruthlessly. He likes to present himself as someone whose business empire supports traditional Czech products, employs local people, but documentary and investigative journalism finds he's a very ruthless businessman. He closes down competitors. He prefers to employ low-paid Ukrainian guest workers than local people in some of his enterprises. There's a huge concentration of power around this one person. There's economic power, there's political power, there's media power, and there's also what we could loosely call kind of security power. A lot of Czech politics is about what you know about the opposition. There are a lot of leaks from police and security services, some of them against Babiš, some of them kind of helping him out. There's an anonymous Twitter account which belongs to an invented person called Julius Schumann, which has been leaking like anything, damaging material. But Babiš has good connections in the security services and has kind of gathered around him a kind of network of former policemen, intelligence officers, and so on. So he's an extraordinary concentration of power. So is he a Czech Donald Trump? Well, he strikes Eurosceptic positions in the way he talks. He has an off-the-cuff, folksy style. So he says, well, we don't want the euro, except we don't want the euro until the Eurozone has reformed. Not yet. He says we're not going to take any more refugees. But all parties in the Czech Republic pretty much are hostile and sceptical about this idea. Some of them say it loudly and xenophobically, some of them say it more kind of politely and cooperatively. So he's somebody, I think, whose politics are not really illiberal and they're not really right-wing. They're not liberal, but they're not actively illiberal. If you've read his book, What I Dream About When I Can Get Some Sleep, you have. What an experience that must have been. What we find is the same anti-political stuff. I'm just a kind of average guy who happens to be a millionaire. One day I came home from work, cracked open a beer, put on the television, and I just realised how corrupt politicians all were. And I know because I've been associating with them. That's kind of quite Trumpian. So I decided to do something about it. But I'm just a kind of average, ordinary kind of person. And Babiš's style, I maybe saw it there, is the baggy jumper, not the sharp suit, but the baggy jumper. So he has this kind of populist style. Me against the establishment, I will bring business in. My movement is, we're not politicians, we get things done, we'll sort it out. And what are his policies? A lot of them are really about modernising the state. So he's interested in a lot of e-government, centralising public procurement, fighting corruption, reforming the political system, and this is the most concerning part. He really wants to get away from any kinds of checks and balances. So he wants to get rid of the second chamber. He wants to get rid of PR and have a two-party system with first past the post. He doesn't think that local councils are needed, just have an elected mayor. He's someone who's incredibly impatient with any kind of bureaucracy and red tape and just wants to do things himself. There's a documentary where he's at the Stork's Nest, where he's being filmed by documentary filmmakers. He's mic'd up, he forgets he's mic'd up, and he rushes off to talk to the Hungarian ambassador, saying in English, he speaks good English as well as French, I do admire Viktor Orban, he can get things done, before he realises that he should get rid of the microphone. So he's someone who is really very impatient about democratic procedures and is keen to strip a lot of checks and balances away, but his agenda is not illiberal socially. There's no real Czech nationalism there. I mean, he's a Slovak. How can he be a Czech nationalist? He did say, I will make the Czech Republic great again, or actually he said, I'll make the Czech Republic excellent again. And he was talking about its economy. So really his pitch is very kind of technocratic. He's not really a free marketeer. His own business receives millions in subsidies from the EU and from the Czech state itself. So he's somebody who's a kind of technocratic populist, if that makes sense, who's opportunistically prepared to lean in to the anti-refugee discourse, which has become the mainstream now in Czech politics. What happens next? And the question we're all asking is, well, is the Czech Republic's democracy going to sort of be dismantled and backslidden in a way that many people think has happened in Poland and Hungary? And I'm afraid the answer is, I don't really know. We don't really know. He's somebody who clearly has authoritarian tendencies. He doesn't really have the votes to change the constitution. He needs other parties to come on board and help him. There are some bad things he can do with a parliamentary majority, like sack the television board, replace the public prosecutor. I noticed that his deputy was saying the first thing we'll do is to ask the public prosecutor to stop those ridiculous corruption charges against Andrej Babiš. He will have much more difficulty changing the constitution, but it's something that can't be ruled out. One route that he might take is to just change the constitution once and allow constitutional referenda. He may wait a few years and try and build up his support in the Senate, allowing him to have a constitutional majority. We simply don't know if he's going to go through with these plans he has in his book, or whether he's simply going to sit there and just govern and not be too controversial. Something that, let's say, Robert Fico, the populist social democrat, has done in Slovakia, rather than doing a kind of frontal assault on liberal constitutional institutions, as has happened in Hungary and Poland, which has attracted the opprobrium of the EU. Babiš doesn't like to be compared to the Czech Trump. He really dislikes it. He says, I'm not like Berlusconi. He thinks he's like Macron. He said, in fact, I gave Macron the idea for this centrist reformist movement. It was me. So he thinks that he's a misunderstood, hard-working reformer like Francois Macron. Okay, so it really boils down to two scenarios. Is it, as some journalists have been commented saying, the end of liberal Czechia? One way or another, it won't be like Hungary, it won't be like Poland, but the country is going to be less democratic, more centralised, more nationalistic, and presided over by Andrej Babiš. Or is it, as Babiš and his supporters say, simply a form of reform politics? It's simply a changing of the guard. It's simply a new movement led by citizens replacing the failed parties. Czechs tried to kind of copy West European parties, so-called standard parties with standard programs of left and right, which were supposed to be like social democrats or conservatives or Christian democrats. And in the end, they just created hollow structures which were captured by vested interests. Babiš says, well, you know, what you see is what you get. You know I'm a millionaire. I'm too rich to be corrupt. The limelight is always on me. You can see what I'm doing. You know I was in the Communist Party. You know I was part of the economic nomenclatura. Everything about me is known. So Babiš's supporters say this is simply a changing of the guard, which is going to reform the country's institutions and politics. And it is true that during the uncomfortable coalition with the Social Democrats, quite a bit of good governance and anti-corruption legislation was passed, although it tended to be used by one group of parties to disadvantage another. So the conflict of interest law was published against Babiš. The regulation of political parties office, which has now been introduced after a long time, was supported by Babiš and his movement. So we don't know what's coming. Now it boils down to one question. I think I've asked the right question, although I didn't have the right answer, which is really, how bad is Babiš? And we simply don't know what he's going to do. The other question I could have put is, how robust are Czech institutions and the people in them, and people in his party and Czech voters? They haven't given him an enormous mandate, but clearly we're in uncharted waters in the Czech Republic, and we don't know what's going to happen next. So on that inconclusive note, I'll finish.